So, to make things clear, this is not a defense of IGN. As far as I'm concerned, mainstream video game critics are the bane of society. This is me, MangaKamen,
super genius,
merely trying to articulate the too much water argument for Pokemon's 3rd generation and the remix because despite being a funny meme,
why is there so much water?
It's a complaint that people really don't consider and hand-wave it away. But it is a serious problem with the game design of Pokemon, especially for that generation. The best way to look at this complaint is to start at the beginning of the generation. It's 2003, and although Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire were out in Japan for a few months last year, the games finally reached the shore of the US of A. And what a generation of Pokemon. It was a generation where the games finally managed to start to become much more refined. Although, in my humble opinion, to be a couple more generations until it reached peak Pokemon perfection.
You can discover over 150 never-before-seen Pokemon as you explore the all-new Unova region.
Abilities, over 100 new monsters to collect, natures, in addition to double battles. While Generations 1 and 2 were the foundation for this groundbreaking series, it wasn't until Generation 3 that the refinement was starting to happen and make Pokemon into a much more robust game series with the potential to become even sharper. It was also the only time in the series where there were two conflicting teams that made the distinction between the versions more blatant, making it so your experience in both games weren't exactly the same depending on the version. Let's face it, there's a reason why Generation 3 is the favorite generation for a lot of people, and that's because it really cemented Pokemon's style and gameplay. Still with the good, there was the bad. Stuff like no post-game in the initial games, the inability to transfer your past Pokemon to the new games, your rivals May and Brendan were being pretty pathetic with only 4 Pokemon at their final team, the two teams were interchangeable with the locations you fought them as well as their motives, double battles weren't really used all that much in the games and contests. Well, the less said about them, the better. We were then introduced to the 3rd installment of the 3rd generation, Emerald, and a few issues were actually fixed, such as the post-game as well as making the teams a bit less stupid in my opinion, but we'll get to that later. However, this comes to the issue that I have with the series. Too much water. There's an obvious imbalance when it comes to the 3rd generation, mainly with its region, Hoenn. Hoenn is supposed to be based upon the Japanese island of Kyushu, a more nature-based as well as having an active volcano in it. Obviously, something like this would elicit a bit of a tropical theme, if that's the right word to use here. That being said, it's here that we have a bit of an issue since the issue comes to balancing of the roster. In Ruby and Sapphire, of the 200 Pokemon you can catch in-game, only about 10 are actually fire types. And 3 of those are locked behind a starter, the Blaziken line. So if you didn't choose Torchic, you were pretty hard-pressed for fire-type representation in the region. Meanwhile, you have about 45 water-type Pokemon. Yeah, there's an obvious disconnect here with the two types, especially considering that the main theme of the game, weather, plays a key part in the story, essentially downpouring rain and blistering sunlight, with the rain actually giving water types a boost and sunlight doing the same for fire types. There's also the choice of fire types, as they're not that great. Blaziken line is actually pretty much the best fire type you can get in the game. It's strong, it can hit hard, and has good typing that can help against one of the types it's weak against. Meanwhile, you've got the Camerupt line, a fire ground type that's 4 times weak to water type attacks. The Magcargo line, a fire and rock type that's 4 times weak to water types. The Ninetales line and Torkoal, both of which are pure fire types. These Pokemon don't have any actual coverage to deal with the water types on their own, and you don't get a lot of coverage either, especially when you realize they left out Houndoom, a fire dark type line that could have at least given a little more type coverage that wouldn't leave a 4-time weakness. In contrast, you've got water types like Ludicolo with its grass typing, Wishcash with its ground typing that can cover other weaknesses, and that's not touching on the pre-established water types like Starmie and Kingdra that you can get in the game as well. Even the boxed legendaries get shafted in this too, since Groudon, as the name implies, isn't a fire type. He has the ability Drought, which can bring in the harsh sunlight, but due to his typing, he doesn't get the Stab, same type attack bonus. While he does get Solar Beam and Eruption, both attacks do get support from sunny weather, but they don't get his Stab. In comparison to Kyogre though, it gets more out of this deal, not only with a type advantage over Groudon, but it could optimize its ability and moveset with the rain it can easily set up, especially since it learns Thunder, a powerful electric move that can become a 100% move in the rain, it gets a boost from the Stab, and a boost from the rain with its water moves. There's also something else to consider when it comes to the legendaries, at least in the original games, and that's when competing against each other, both legendaries are not equal. I think I've already explained why Groudon is the inferior legendary, which sucks because I love Groudon. Not in that way! He just has a much cooler design! And it sucks that in a one-on-one fight, Kyogre would win against Groudon, and here's why. It's how they're specially built. This was before the physical special split for Pokemon moves, meaning that water, grass, and fire type moves were all considered special type moves. And since Groudon's based attacks are the only ones that would get stabbed, they wouldn't get super effective against Kyogre. Even if he did use super effective moves, Groudon's special attack, while not being anything to sneeze at, is not as good as Kyogre's special attack and defense. I think it's apparent that there's a major imbalance in the Pokemon themselves with a large emphasis on the water typing. And let's take a moment to look at the other types that also got shafted. Ground types, 22. Ice types, 6. Fighting types, 11. Dark types, 10. I understand that water types in general in Pokemon are abundant, but there's such a vast gap here. Even grass types have 21 members that you can catch. But we're just getting started here. There's more reasons to say why too much water is actually a valid complaint. I'm sure that most people are going to guess what I'm going to say here because of the story. There's an issue of water, and I know that's the point, but if you're going to say this...
As a bit of a Pokemon nerd, when someone complains about all the water in Pokemon Sapphire, it tells me you failed fundamentally to understand the story between the two legendary Pokemon in that particular game.
There's more issues with the water in Generation 3, most notably Team Magma and Aqua essentially being interchangeable in the story, just with a different end goal and a splash of paint. That's really the biggest issue, that until Emerald came out in which both teams were competing against each other, and Ruby and Sapphire, both Aqua and Magma would switch things around, and it's kind of the same issue with Oras as well. Especially when you consider that the remakes basically are reskinned versions of the first games. Now, you may be wondering about the whole, why does too much water apply to the story? It's because even with Team Magma, water plays a pivotal role. They'll have a base at the waterfront, they'll go after a submarine, and they'll find Groudon in an underwater cave. Okay, I know I'm stretching a little bit with that one, but here's a good question. Why the is the Magma Grunt training Wailmer? Like, I get that it's used to block the way so players can't skip the story beats in Lily Cove, but why not have some other Earth-based reason for this? You see, the thing about Ruby and Sapphire, and to a lesser degree Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, is that their stories are interchangeable, despite the fact that both stories have key different elements, and I use that word quite rightly, since despite the fact that Team Aqua and Magma have different goals, how they go about it are the same. Take for example Mount Chimney. Both teams want to use the active volcano, albeit for different ways, but both ideas kind of suck. Aqua wants to make the volcano dormant so it can capture rainwater and expand the amount of water, which is kind of dumb, especially when you consider that this is a mountain and would have to be more akin to having snow on it, but whatever. Magma, well, they want to make the volcano explode and kill everyone around with magma to expand the land. Yeah, that idea kind of sucks. Especially when you consider the fact they're trying to expand the land for Pokemon and people. Oh yeah, let's just blow up an entire volcano, killing so many people in the process. But hey, we got another 10 acres, that's awesome! But the point is, most of the story has the bad guys being interchangeable. Now, this was changed in Emerald where you had to fight against both teams, and it made more sense for what they did as well as where their bases were. Like having Team Magma take a base in Mount Chimney. That makes more sense than having a base on the waterfront in Lily Cove City. But Oras unfortunately does the same thing as Ruby and Sapphire. And it's worse because it feels like Alpha Sapphire's story was completed first, and Omega Ruby's story was just a copy and paste of the story with a little bit of a switch here. I feel the issue was with time constraints if you ask me on that, but however, let's talk again about Emerald. Emerald did a lot of great things for Generation 3, with not only the story, but also improvements, such as making double battles more prominent, abilities were given more effects, especially in the wild, and of course, the beauty that is the Battle Frontier. That being said, there's a big issue, and that's to the too much water complaint. And it's a change that's really weird. For some reason, Game Freak thought it would be a good idea to change not only the last gym leader, but also the champion of the games. Now, Steven Stone was an awesome champion. He was tough, and he didn't specialize in just one single type. And I can appreciate him becoming a super boss in Emerald, but the issue comes that the final gym leader and the champion are both water type users in Emerald. Thankfully, this change wasn't made in Oras, but Oras still has its own problems, and they aren't related to the actual water issue that's the focus on this video. But that idea goes with the EXP share that the game has in it. But now that we've talked about that, Ah, yes, we finally reached the biggest part, the actual water of Hoenn. The idea of land versus sea was a prominent factor in the games, and most notably within the region's design. The idea was that there would be 17 water routes and 17 earth-based routes, and that's a cool idea. But the problem was that the routes that were water-based had a few issues. It's because unlike the land-based routes, which had a various amount of biomes in them, we had forests, mountains, deserts, volcanic caves, even cities if you want to include them, and there was a lot of creativity put in the world there. Not to mention, there was quite the variety of Pokemon you could catch in them, or the types of trainers you could face with various Pokemon to fight against. In comparison with the water routes, there's a ton of recycling assets, and you're forced to face against a small pool of water-based Pokemon, and thus forcing the player to carry a grass or electric type Pokemon in their team in order to deal with the various types. You'd also need a water type or a Pokemon that could use the Surf HM even to traverse them. Let's talk about HMs for a moment. Now, before Game Freak decided to finally put an X to these damn things, HMs were required moves to get around the map in order to get past various natural obstacles, and you'd have a dedicated Pokemon in your party to be an HM slave. Basically, they'd have all these moves because the moves, say for Surf and Fly, weren't all that great in battle. So this limited the kinds of Pokemon you could carry in the customization of your Pokemon as well. And for a series that prides itself on allowing you to have a fully customizable team of characters of various elements, abilities, stats, and designs, that's not good! That's not good at all! And let's talk about the original water routes because this was a problem that was fixed in ORAS, and that was the encounter rate in water that was absurdly high. You want to talk about how Zubat were annoying? Let's talk about the water Pokemon like Tentacool! But yeah, let's just say it's annoying how the world in Gen 3 and in ORAS could be considered bad, and especially because of the water. So, I know that the reviewer in question, Callie Plaguey, has recently come under fire for her review of Cyberpunk 2077.
Yeah, there's so much that I ignored because I was like, why? There's a lot of stuff on the periphery that I was just like, I am never going to use this. Like, I crafted like one thing. There's like a whole crafting interface and like all this crafting stuff. I barely touched it, but it was just like, help the cops catch these criminals. And I was like, what if I don't want to help the cops? And then I would just drive away. That's kind of what I mean by there's stuff I feel like I didn't fully explore, like weapons. I feel like I didn't mess with my weapons at all. There's a bunch of weapon attachments I didn't bother with. I got mantis blades like way later and I used them like once.
I can't really say to the actual facts since I haven't played Cyberpunk yet, so don't expect me to actually touch on that, even though it's a bit jarring to hear that come from her mouth and seeing her review contradict each other. That being said, the too much water meme is an actual argument that can be made about Pokemon Generation, and to an extent, the same can be said about ORAS. Like I said before, this isn't a defense of Callie Plaguey, but rather to focus on the actual stupidity of the too much water meme that people who haven't actually thought about the reasons why people would criticize the game with this. Yes, it's a dumb blurb. Too much water.
Of course, this is not the first time Kaylee has found herself amidst a controversy of her own making. There was the 2014 review she had written at IGN for the game Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, in which the game was deducted points for having too much water.
Make fun of it all you want, that's perfectly fine, but this is really unfair to the actual criticism, because unlike a lot of people who bring up this review all the time, it ignores what was actually said, and are only reading the blurb, when all they'd have to do is scroll down and see that it's not so simple. Here's what's actually said in the review. It's not a new complaint, but Hoenn is still imbalanced type-wise, heavily favoring water. It's especially noticeable in Alpha Sapphire, in which Team Aqua, the villains of the piece, use a lot of water types. It feels like there was a water Pokemon in every battle, and I have an overleveled Pikachu to show for it. You also have to navigate many bodies of water since much of the late game involves the HM Surf and Dive to get from place to place. Diving was really neat back in 2002 when it was new, but I found it incredibly tedious in Alpha and Omega. An obvious example of how superfluous some HMs are. Now, Plaguey deserves criticism. I'm not going to deny that. That's perfectly fine if it's just legitimate criticism. But when it comes to the games, especially games that I love, we can't just hand-wave away this type of criticism when it actually has some level of being correct. Pokemon is a series that I thoroughly enjoyed for the years, but by doing this sort of thing, by hand-waving away criticism like this, we don't allow the game companies to actually listen to fans when we have an issue with the games. I mean, it's highly unlikely Pokemon would listen, considering how they've been going about the last couple of years, but hey, what do I know? Gamers are fun people, but we're also our worst enemies when it comes to stuff like this. But hey, that's just one gamer's opinion. What's yours? Let me know down below in the comments. I'm MangaKamen, and remember to examine your fandom. Thanks for watching.